Welcome to the Sustainable Dish Podcast. I'm Diana Rogers, a real food registered dietitian, author, and sustainability advocate. I co-host this podcast with James Connolly, who was a producer on my film, Sacred Cow. I also founded the Global Food Justice Alliance, an initiative advocating for the inclusion of animal-sourced foods like meat, dairy, and eggs for a more nutritious, sustainable, and equitable worldwide food system. You can check it out and join me at globalfoodjustice.org. Thanks again for listening, and now on to our show.
Cool. This is James Connolly for Sustainable Dishes podcast. I had, through just a great sort of small and growing network of people, I had somebody sort of reach out to kind of introduce you and I together. Thomas Locke is on today. We've had some like small chats sort of back and forth. I really wanted to bring him on the podcast for a multitude of different reasons. He's a cattle rancher. Actually, you have an integrated farm, right? You have pigs, you have chickens, and you have cattle. And I've been trying to dive more and more into kind of younger families, a younger generation of people who are going into this for myriad different reasons, but also because of its ecological function. Animals' ecological function, if we actually put them back onto the land, what they can do for soil, and people who are kind of coming at this from a very different space, because most of farming is multi-generational. Most of it sort of gets passed on, and it doesn't have to be sort of nuclear families, but it is sort of like it kind of falls into a very specific niche. And so we wanted to kind of like just dive into sort of basic background story, where you came from, how you ended up kind of in a space where this is what you chose, right? And so welcome. Thank you so much for coming on, Thomas. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, James, thanks for having me. We met through a mutual friend, and I've really enjoyed talking to you these last few days as well. But my story is not, I guess, a traditional story for farming. In fact, everyone that I meet out here, when they learn that I'm a farmer, or not just out here, but really anywhere, they say it's just a family business. And it's not. We've had this land since about 1850. My family moved from Tennessee to Northeast Texas, and the land that we're on was a perennial grassland. It's up on a hill. We're just south of Bois Creek, and that's the name of the farm, is Bois Meat Company. And the first thing that my ancestors did when they moved out here, like everyone else, was they got a plow and they started cultivating the land for crops. And being on a hill, this land really isn't suited for vegetable production or cotton production or peanuts or whatever else they were growing. And anytime there wasn't a living root system in the ground keeping the soil together, it just washed away and blew away. And so fast forward 100 years, which to Mother Nature is a blip of time, my grandfather came back from World War II, and we literally were not able to grow anything on the farm anymore because all of our topsoil had washed away. And so his only solution in his mind was to start raising cattle. But of course, in that post-World War II, ammonium nitrate was abundant. The Green Revolution had started. And so he really adopted that industrial model, started seeding Bermuda out here, wanted to go for a monoculture, and fertilized the land. And so until about 2005, when my uncle moved up here, the soil continued to be degraded. And really, we were farming a sub-level, or not topsoil, but compacted subsoil at that point. My uncle started intensive mob grazing and stopped using chemicals. And then when my wife and I moved out here in 2014, we really started adopting a regenerative, diverse soil building practice, because we recognized the fact that this was really degraded land and we wanted to rebuild it. So but that didn't actually answer your question at all. I went to school.
That's great though. I was going to stop you there.
Yeah, I went to school at Austin College, which is a small liberal arts school in North Texas, and was a sociology major and an anthropology major. And I took those classes because they were the most interesting classes. I had long hair and earrings, and was extremely progressive. And so my first job out of college was to moved to Massachusetts, and I was a campus organizer. And then from there, lived in New York City for a little while. as a Canvas director. And then felt, I guess I was 25 or 6 years old and felt, well, now I need to figure out what I'm going to actually do with my life. And so I moved back to Georgetown, Texas, which is where I'm from, and I started fundraising. And it just wasn't for me. So I met my wife, Jillian. We went to Durham, North Carolina, so she could go to Duke for graduate school. And I fell in love with sustainable agriculture out there. There are farms like Cane Creek Farm and Brayburn Farm and Pickle Creek Farm and Little Tree Farm and all these wonderful places where the farmers were educated. They had these lifestyles that were extremely attractive. I could see how they were solving problems by the way that they were treating animals and raising animals and healing their land. And I realized that we had this land in Northeast Texas that wasn't really being used. So it occurred to me that's what I could do with my life. And it was the strongest calling that I'd ever felt before, was that I needed to stop doing what I was doing and move back to Texas and start farming. And so we did that.
Yeah, you're like the fourth anthropology major who's gone into ranching. I've
Really?
talked to even just recently. Do you think there's like a correlation between those studies and kind of moving on to, and I mean, it obviously has an environmental footprint when you're studying anthropology, but I do feel like it pulls you out of our civilizational culture in a way that gets you kind of look at things very with a very unique lens.
Yeah, I don't know. I would guess that that more has to do with just the type of person that would choose to study anthropology as opposed to, or at least for me, what I learned in those classes. But yeah, I mean, it was in college that I really started to recognize the fact that in my opinion, our way of life, our system of living is just fundamentally broken, and that we're really on a path to nowhere. And I just didn't agree with that at all. And I didn't have any solutions for what I wanted to do to fix it. But yeah, that's when I started to recognize that, the assumptions that I had made as a child, that, you had to get married, you had to wear a tie to work, you had to blah, 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 wear a certain type of shoe and have a certain kind of house and have your yard look a certain way, that those were just kind of meaningless. And it began to occur to me that, the resources that we were consuming were not endless either. And so I really credit my education at Austin College with that. But at the same time, I never, ever thought that I was going to be a farmer, like ever. I would have just laughed at you if you had told me that. But it was, like I said, it was the strongest calling I've ever had to do something.
Yeah. And your wife is on board?
She is, yeah. So we have it's kind of a funny story. When we started dating, I brought her to the farm. My grandparents were still alive, and there's the old farmhouse. It's still here. We built a house, which is where I am now. But the old farmhouse was literally built around the log cabin that my ancestors built in 1850. And, there's no central heat or air, and there's one tiny bathroom, and it's just not a very comfortable place. And my grandparents were very interested in us not sleeping in the same room, even though we were adults and blah, blah, blah. So, we went to bed in separate rooms, the east room and the west room. But of course, I just walked across the hallway at night to get in bed with Jillian. But my grandfather had this habit of walking up the stairs to check on people. So I shut the door, but the heat source was from downstairs. And so we woke up and it was December. I think she visited over Christmas, and like the room was literally 30 degrees and she was just painted to my body, freezing to death. And so when I told her that I wanted to move to the farm to become a farmer, right, I think her words were, I would rather live in a car for the rest of my life than move to the farmhouse. And so that was her first impression. But yeah, she's down. I really credit Jillian a lot. I mean, I just wouldn't be doing this without her. She actually works at Austin College now, where we both went. And cool. Yeah, we have a good life out here. We love it.
Yeah. So tell me about your farm. So acreage, what you're growing, all of it. Let's go to town on some details.
So, when we settled the land a long time ago, the family grew, and obviously it broke up, and land was, owned by other family members. And my great grandmother kind of brought the farm back together. And that's 160 acres. So what we own is 160 acres. And then I lease another approximately 160 acres. So And on that land, we raise cattle, 100% grass-fed beef, chickens for eggs, chickens for meat, turkeys at Thanksgiving, and pasture-raised pigs, although we're getting out of the pig business and just focusing mostly on cattle and chickens right now.
Okay.
And diversity is extremely important to me. I want a diverse grassland because that's what this land was. It was a grassland. It should be a grassland. So, this fall I seeded 10 different cover crops, vetch and clovers and ryegrass and wheat and various other things. And that's really what we focus on, ecological diversity on the farm. We have wild turkeys, bobcats, eagles, hawks, snakes, a whole bunch of wild pigs, which, are a pain, but they're here. Saw a mountain lion last year out here for the first time. Just a lot of ecological diversity, which I welcome. And we practice high density grazing on certain pastures. So we use polywire and electric wire to move our cattle. And then on the land that is still, unfortunately, kind of in a Bermuda monoculture, we manage that land a little bit differently with our cattle. But we have a 100% grass-fed beef business. We are organic, but not certified. So we have completely moved away from any kind of dewormer. We don't use any chemical fertilizers. We don't use any herbicides or pesticides. If a cow is about to die, we will give it antibiotics, but we're going to take it out of production and sell it at the sale barn. And really just working on the genetics of the animals. My grandfather had large framed animals out here because that's what feedlots want. They want to be able to put on a bunch of muscle in a feedlot, but we want short, stocky, thrifty animals, cows, so that can marble well on grass. And we take our time with that. That was the biggest mistake that I made when I first started, was that, I had been to grazing workshops and they said, oh, you can finish an animal in 18 months, or, certainly 24 months, a cow will be finished. And in my opinion, the best grass-fed beef is really 36 months old or more.
Tell me why. Why do you think?
Well, it just takes longer for cows to put on fat. And it was described to me once as, cows are kind of like children. When they're young, they're super sweet and tender. And then they go through this, really rough, terrible teenage phase where they're tough and terrible. And then they get older, they get a little, fatter, and they mellow out a lot. And, we really want those cows to get to that mellowing out, gaining weight, chilling out phase before we process them. And that's just, there's good quality grass-fed beef and there's really, really bad grass-fed beef. And we've produced both of them on this farm.
Right. Yeah, there's a guy in Spain, and I'm sure he just specialty restaurants and stuff like that. He was raising his cattle for somewhere upwards of like 12 to 14 years. And he just said the taste difference is just, you wouldn't be able to even just compare the two. We have seen when we were filming Sacred Cow, we went to Dierendank, which is a butcher in Belgium, sort of a superstar. Like we were going through the airport, and we saw this 24-foot poster of him. This like ex skater kid, kind of punk scene, then got into butchery. His father was a butcher. He was doing a lot of stuff with dairy cattle. Absolutely delicious marbling. Dry aged, but like you could actually really tell the difference. He was sort of he said that because we've divided so many of these sort of aspects of even just cattle production, he said that we've sort of lost a lot of the flavoring aspects of what we could do with these animals. He had a small farm as well. He was raising, I don't know, maybe about 30 head of cattle. But he was also doing something with pigs where he was trying to go back to what was the original Roman pig that would sort of travel with with the armies. So smaller, more mobile, kind of eat anything, just go anywhere. Type of thing.
That reminds me of
really
Lonesome Dove. I don't know
space.
if you've ever seen or read Lonesome Dove, but there's two pigs that follow them on their cattle drive from. There's two pigs that follow them on their cattle drive from South Texas all the way up to Montana.
Yeah, they used to have pig drives in North Carolina. They would say there was a book that came out years ago that would talk about like you would see these pig drives of like thousands of pigs just going to market. Just
Wow.
imagine seeing that. Yeah, absolutely stunning. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So, I mean, so tell me, like, uh, how long did it take you to get to the to where you are in terms of numbers? And yeah, tell me about the experience. You know.
Well, it's every year has been a little bit different out here.
Yeah.
And the only reason that that I'm able to farm, we'd probably still be in North Carolina if we didn't own the land.
Right.
Because, land out here, they just actually dammed up Boardart Creek. So now Boardart Lake is just north of our farm. So the land prices have gone from about $4,000 an acre to about $25,000 an acre. But agricultural land around here, you'll be lucky if you get it for $4,000 an acre.
Yeah.
So, to raise cattle, you need land. And so 100 acres, 4,000 acres, $400,000.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be farming and not making any money for 2 or 3 years, that's impossible. So, that's
Mm.
obviously a huge deterrent. But um, the number of animals has changed a lot. I've started focusing more on building soil and lowering the amount of cattle that I have on the farm. And Jillian's income at Austin College has helped me do that. But if we didn't have that, if we were just farming for an income, I'd be a little bit more diverse with the number of animals I have out here, and I'd really have to
Right.
hustle a lot more with direct marketing to folks, and trying to just maximize sales as much as possible,
Yeah.
as opposed to spending most of my time on the farm, which is what I like to do, building soil. So long story short, we finish about 20 cows a year out here. And if they're 3 years old, we've got 20, 40, 60, and then we have about 30 mama cows. So, we have about 90 cows out here. And to make the amount of money that I need to make, and also build soil the way that I want, that's a good number. I'd kind of like to lower the number even a little bit more.
Mm.
Um, Last summer was the second hottest and driest summer in the last 50 years out here. So that
Yeah.
kind of helped me want to decrease the size of our herd a little bit more. But we didn't have to sell any animals during that time. And stock trailers were lined up for miles in both directions at sale barns across the state last summer, because it was 108 degrees in June, and it didn't rain from pretty much July until October. And
Wow.
so if your soil isn't healthy, if it doesn't have high levels of organic matter and isn't able to hold water, it's just going to die very, very quickly. And my grandfather's old hay meadow, which he fertilized all the time, if it gets above 90 degrees and it doesn't rain for a week, that grass dies because the soil
Right.
is still so unhealthy out there.
Yeah. And so most of your business is direct consumer and farmers markets in and around Dallas. Is that true? Or
Yeah, I was going to the Dallas farmers market for what was it, 7 years,
Mm.
and we had a child, and so I wanted to spend more time with him at home on the weekends. So I started selling wholesale.
Okay.
Sold to Whole Foods for a little while, and now sell to other folks in the area that then direct market it to folks. And I still have customers that I sell to as well. So at first, it was very much direct marketing and a lot of hustling, promoting the business, getting press, and just building relationships with people.
Yeah.
But probably the biggest mistake that I made at the beginning was the fact that I didn't really know what I was doing as far as quality was concerned. So the pork was good, but the beef wasn't that good. And
Mm.
so, I lost customers because they would go home with a New York strip that was just tough, just wasn't very good.
Okay.
And so, so if someone was to get into grass-fed beef, I would really just encourage them to understand how to put marbling on a cow, understand the land that they're going to be raising beef on, and figure out how to do it in a good way and just don't cut any corners.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that has been a struggle in some ways with regenerative ag is to sort of uh, um, teach teach a methodology of thinking and problem solving that is based on the land that you're with. Like a farmer in Arizona is going to deal with way different issues than somebody from Texas or even in the Northeast. And so it's hard to kind of like systematize and sort of figure out a way to kind of teach that, right?
Yeah, so many people will say, well, how many cows do you raise per acre? And I say, well, it depends. Well, what are you going to do this summer? Well, it depends. It just, there are no black and white answers out here.
Right.
If the grass is growing really, really well, we might, move the cows 3 times a day.
Yeah.
If I have a pasture, such as what we call our Dutton pasture, which is on the highway, it's a county road, that was plowed up incessantly, I might just leave that for a year. So it just depends.
Yeah.
That's the answer to regenerative farming, and that's in such a stark contrast to an industrial model, which seeks to control everything and really has no reverence for nature, or for the natural laws and practices of nature. It's just strong arming things, and my philosophy is more to have a very, very healthy respect for nature and try to not control things as much as I want to, because ultimately we can't control things. We can manipulate soil and nature for a little while, but ultimately, it's not a sustainable venture.
Yeah. How was the you hit hard by the snowstorms that came in?
Yeah, I mean, the last 3 years, actually, the weather in Texas, Northeast Texas, for the last 3 years has been extreme. We
Yeah.
had a thunderstorm come through that had 100-mile-an-hour winds last year that blew
Wow.
over. Actually, I built a greenhouse for my garden, and it blew that about 100 yards. We had this thing called a polar vortex. I mean, Texas got national news because our power grid failed,
Yeah.
and that was a week of breaking ice in the ponds for the cows and the pigs, and we're not set up for winter weather out here. So I mean, the fuel in our tractor froze. So luckily, I put out a whole bunch of hay as a wind block for the cows, like old hay, and they ended up just eating that. So yeah, it posed a lot of problems for us, but that's
Yeah.
farming.
I did an interview with it's Chuck Howley's ranch, not too far away from you.
Yeah.
But he was saying how that they were lucky they had horses because they couldn't use any of the equipment to kind of get around and break
Right.
up the ponds and all of that stuff. He said one of his calves was eaten by a mountain lion. Just ripped the leg off of it. This is all happening. I think he was, I don't know, what was he, a year into taking over the ranch? So,
Yeah, I actually sold next to him once at the farmers market in Dallas, I think.
yeah. Yeah, he's a great
Yeah.
guy. Yeah.
He's got a lot more land than I do. I mean, I am a very, very small regenerative cattle ranch, and he's got a lot more land. And I think about him and other farmers in our area that have thousands and thousands of acres. And I think he
Right.
might have about 1,000 acres. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That they're not doing anything with. It's just land, and they might have a few cows out there to get their ag exemption, but there is an enormous amount of potential to raise grass-fed regenerative beef and other animals on land just in Northeast Texas. So when people say that it's not a scalable enterprise, I really do think that it is scalable. And if we were able to take desecrated land and regenerate that soil, start growing diverse grass species out there with grazing animals, which is what nature did for thousands and thousands of years, that we could actually produce a lot of beef and a lot of food for people by just using land differently.
Yeah. Isn't there, I don't remember the statistics on this, but the tax exemptions for agricultural land are, there's a huge percentage of it are people who actually just live in cities. They own this land as a tax break. And so a lot of it just sort of sits there.
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot of research, even just over the past 2 years, and I wanted to get your perspective on it. After 2008, I think what ended up happening with a lot of college endowments, a lot of retirement funds, a lot of insurance agencies, was that they had always been okay with the sense of sort of agricultural outputs. They would stop at the fence post. right? So if you go through the 70s and 80s, you would kind of stop at the fence post. 2008 kind of opened up the agricultural landscape to all of these institutions that are kind of starting to buy up land. They tried it in the 70s, late 70s, but there was such a blowback from the farming community because you don't want these absentee landlords around, right? People who are kind of trying to take over this agricultural space. And some of it is getting at the water underneath. Some of it is specialty crops like almond production and wine and all this other stuff. But I think the inflation in agricultural land prices is at least part to do with what happened in 2008. And so I think there is a lot of kind of and you're getting also urban sprawl, right? So you're getting a lot of people kind of wanting more space outside of the cities, and they're kind of coming in on agricultural land. So I don't know if you've experienced that or you have any opinion on that or anything like that.
No, I don't have a lot of knowledge on that. I mean, actually, I wish Jillian was here. She worked for Goldman Sachs right out of college, and part of her job was valuing these massive farms in the Midwest that the bank was going to buy and use as an investment. But land prices, have gone up significantly, and my grandfather would be completely shocked to know that our land is worth more now than the land near Boardwalk Creek or Bottomland that has more fertile soil, because people would want to buy our land for the view, because they want to just have land. And I actually lease land from a couple of people who don't live out here, but they have the land, and they used to cut hay on it, or they'd put a few cows on it, and they would get their tax exemption that way. So but the value of land is not based on growing things anymore. It's, at least out here, it's based on people from Dallas or Fort Worth wanting to have a second home and get out of the city. And I don't know the stats on this, but I think we have 895 million acres of farmland, and that's been going down every single year just because of development. So if we were to sell this land, there is no way that anybody would ever farm out here. I mean, they would build a community subdivision, or someone with a lot of money would just come out here and hang out. So
that's insane.
And
in my mind,
part of the problem with that is that I think about soil all the time, but healthy soil is the largest carbon bank on Earth. And we learned about it in 7th grade science or before. Plants, through the process of photosynthesis, take carbon dioxide and convert it into an organic carbon that they then exchange with soil microorganisms that rely on that carbon, and then the soil microorganisms give them the essential nutrients that plant needs to survive. So without that carbon exchange, we would live on the moon. There would be nothing growing here. And so soil sequesters carbon. When we till soil, we release that carbon, and then we don't give the soil any tools to sequester more carbon. And so, from a climate change perspective, the more healthy grasslands and woodlands that we have, the more carbon can be sequestered. And we have this mother lode of carbon already in our atmosphere. It's not just about, having solar panels and driving electric vehicles. It's about, what are we going to do with all the carbon that's already here? How are we going to sequester that? And I don't hear anybody talking about soil. I mean, I hear some people, but on the larger national media, I just never hear that. And that seems like a huge missed opportunity.
Well, I think they are moving into trying to create a market for that. And you can see it in places, especially sub-Saharan Africa, places like Gabon, places that in Kenya, there was a news report that came out where there you have, say Netflix, which its streaming services, or the carbon footprint for streaming, the data banks just required for you to be able to watch 100 years of thousands of movies requires enormous amount of energy. And so they've started to do these kind of carbon offset programs. And it's mostly going to agricultural, it's going to older forests, denser forests, and you're not really sequestering carbon. What you're doing is you're holding on to the carbon that's already there. You're saying that this is being held off for development. I actually genuinely have a problem with the notion of these like single solution things that, to climate change. It's like we've pumped all this carbon into the atmosphere and now we have to take it down. And the only way to do that is that, because I think the thing that I fell in love with regenerative agriculture was it got rid of some of the myopia around carbon. It started to talk about water holding on the land. It started to talk about like building structures within the soil that actually look towards biodiversity, that bring in, all of the different aspects of, I mean, we used to have pastoralist cultures, like transhumance cultures, say in Spain, that would deliver seeds through the seed coat of sheep as they move like hundreds and hundreds of miles to go, downland in winter and upland in the summertime. So for me, like regenerative agriculture goes into the sort of multi-formed idea of like what the purpose of agriculture should be going forward. The carbon thing, I just like it, as soon as you can make a market out of it. I know it's America, so you got to make a market out of something.
Yeah. Well, money
You
is
know?
the one thing that everybody believes in. I mean, you and I talked about the book *Sapiens*.
Right.
In it he mentions that Osama bin Laden didn't love one thing about America, but he loved American money. It's that one myth that we all believe in. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not, when people talk about rewilding areas, especially folks who are vegan, we need to stop eating meat so that we can rewild these areas to hold on to and sequester carbon. If we're not going to be making any money on that land, there's no way we're going to be rewilding it. Like that just doesn't, that goes against the entire ethos of the United States of America. We're not just going to have 1,000 acres and just let trees grow there and have the land not make any money.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, we do have large form, billionaires who are actually doing that. We call it sort of fortress colonialism. They're not taking American land per se, but they are, what, in all honesty, they're taking parts of Scotland, taking parts of Ireland, and buying them for rewilding schemes. I do think that we have started to see that more and more, but definitely places within South America are being bought out by large nonprofits and billionaires to sort of hold on to these places that would be sort of biodiversity hotspots all over the world. In the same way that we talk about the Amazon. The problem that I have with it is that we keep on thinking these ecosystems can survive on their own, independent of the world that surrounds them. And so I interviewed a guy on insect decline, and he was talking specifically about that. And he said LUK National Forest in Puerto Rico has not recovered its insect species, even though it was considered, a biological hotspot zone. Saw a massive and significant insect decline. And that insect decline, your regenerative agriculture, about trophic cascades. Like if you're not bringing insects in, then that means the biodiversity of the soil is, close to non-existent. Then you have all the bird species, nobody's passing seeds, through birds. Everything kind of really depends upon insects. And so like for me, the conversation behind regenerative agriculture is this sort of multi-formed, we're doing soil, but only because soil means so much more to everything else that's around there.
right. Yeah.
Sorry, lecture's
Absolutely.
over.
No. I mean, it's so true. And I think, we're increasingly as a culture just looking for black and white answers to really complex questions. And I think people actually listen for that. So when they're listening to maybe me speak or somebody else speak, they're looking for that black and white answer. But it goes back to the it depends thing. Like we just, it's so connected and we really don't understand it. People understand how soil functions a little bit, like Ray Archuleta and Nicole Masters and other soil experts, but they'll be the first to admit that they really don't understand how soil functions. We just don't quite get it yet. And it's that being comfortable with not understanding, but being curious and wanting to continue to understand, that's so fascinating to me. It's why I love my job so much. I mean, when we stopped using ivermectin to deworm our cattle, I remember the next summer, I was with the cows under a grove of persimmon trees, and all of these bugs were flying around, and they were dung beetles. which are,
Right.
vital to a regenerative
Yeah.
cattle ranch. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, the dung beetles have returned, and it's because we weren't using chemical dewormer
Wow.
anymore. Um,
That's amazing.
yeah, it was a kind of a, I don't know, an epiphany for me. Like, this is
Yeah.
actually working. So I did this for this reason, and here it is. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's all connected, and we're connected. Humans are connected to nature too. Uh, Going back to Sapiens, like he talks about 70,000 years ago, humans had a cognitive revolution, and we were the first creatures that we're aware of that stopped just living in an objective reality, and we started, living in an imagined reality, and that allowed
Mm.
us to believe that we could control nature even more than we already did. Um, and humans, fast forward 70,000 years, we really do not feel like we are part of nature. We feel like we are
Oh yeah.
separate from nature, completely
Yeah.
separate. And that's one of the most dangerous and destructive aspects of humans, I think, is just the fact that we think that we're separate from what's going on, but we're not. We're all connected.
Yeah. I remember somebody making the argument that, in fact, like dung beetles are keystone species because they're the first ones who can break into cow patties that allow
Hmm.
all the other insects to sort of like begin the process of breaking all that stuff down. They're just absolutely integral to the environment.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, *Sapiens* is a really interesting book. I think we kind of like to shortly talked about it. He um, I would I'd love to get a sense of where he's gone with a lot of his work since then, because he wrote a
Hmm.
book called Homo Deus. He kind of talked about the birth of AI. He seems to have moved into a space where I think um, he thinks of this sort of uh, uh, I think he's starting to think a lot more mechanistically about this idea of like technology and human beings sort of starting to meld together. And I don't understand how the person who wrote *Sapiens*, right,
Yeah.
like one became vegan, but also lives in like Israel has become a hub of veganism in many different ways, and he's been one of the larger proponents of it. And I just don't understand how you studied that much anthropology and sort of ignore some of all of the cost of actually taking that food out of your diet. Yeah, love to have a
Yeah.
conversation with him about that.
Yeah. Yeah. It would be great. I mean, I thought it was
Yeah.
a brilliant book. I just read it, which is why I'm
Okay.
mentioning it. But and I think that it was brilliant just because it was very accessible.
Mhm.
When my brother-in-law told me about it, I thought this is going to be dense. I'm not going to like reading it.
Yeah.
But he's a great writer. It was easy to read, and it just provided this unique history of how we got to where we are as human beings. Um, but yeah, I mean, he's clearly taken the route of, technology is going to take over. Um,
Right.
and my perspective on life is really not to always be looking forward, but to look backwards. I mean, I think that we need to embrace so many of the things that we used to do, as opposed to just forgetting about them and just moving forward. I mean, that's what my model of regenerative agriculture is all about. It's not about embracing new technology or new science. It's about observing humbly, how nature functions. Um, and Wendell Berry is another great author
Yeah.
for understanding that. A little bit more dated as far as his writing is concerned. But one of my favorite quotes from him was, um, "There are no sacred and unsacred places. There are just sacred and desecrated places."
Mm.
And our farm was a desecrated place, and in many ways still is a desecrated place because we haven't been able to rebuild the soil and the ecological diversity like it was before humans messed with it. I consider a feedlot a desecrated place. I consider a monoculture soy field that's dependent on chemical fertilizer and herbicides and pesticides to be a desecrated place. Um, but that field's sacredness hasn't left it. It's still there. We just have to allow it to come back. And so, um, to me, it's not the soybean that's the problem or the cow that's the problem. It's the system of agriculture that we're practicing that's the problem.
Yeah.
And in everything that we do, raising cattle, pigs, chickens, corn, soy, spinach, whatever, we need to be practicing soil building, regenerative practices on that land. If we have, I think, in my opinion, yeah, any hope of continuing to feed people, in the next couple of hundred years without
Yeah,
replicating cells in the lab.
yeah, oh yeah, it's so important to me. The thing that I find, one of the quotes that I absolutely love is you plant the seed of a tree that under which shade you'll never sit under.
Yeah.
And I think that farming can sort of start to move into that mind space. And yeah, I remember when we interviewed Joel Salatin. His grandfather, or even I think it was his grandfather, had bought the cheapest land that he could buy at the time, the most degraded land. They were able to build, um, somewhere around 12 inches of topsoil over the years, by being a grass farmer, by looking at all of these different inputs. And yeah, I think his structure is very different from most farms. But I think that you're standing on this spongy, like beautiful, like soil as you're walking through that space, and you're just like, you can barely imagine what it looked like before. He's such an evocative teacher in so many different ways, so you can kind of get it into your imagination. But it's such a proud moment, I think, to sort of see over the course of this man's lifetime how much could be built.
Yeah. Well, he's kind of the prophet of, I'm 40 years old. So many farmers like me, sociology major at a liberal arts college, thought I was going to wear a tie to work every day, decided to start farming. I mean, that's in large part because of, watching a Joel Salatin YouTube video and being inspired by him. And he has his qualities and, his challenges, but he's, clearly a very provocative, inspiring person in many ways. And yeah, I would almost think that almost everybody my age that's in regenerative agriculture, especially raising animals, has been inspired by Joel Salatin at some point.
Yeah.
This podcast was made possible by my favorite electrolyte company, started by my friend and Sacred Cow co-author, Rob Wolf, Element, the all-natural sugar-free powder you just add to water, which tastes great and gives you the perfect amount of sodium, potassium, and magnesium to keep you perfectly hydrated. They have a limited time new grapefruit flavor, and I've developed a recipe on my blog for the salty grapefruit limeade, and I know you'll love it. So check it out, and also take advantage of Element's free flavor sample pack with your purchase. So just visit sustainabledish.com/LMNT to place your order. Remember, just drinking plain water could actually leave you more dehydrated, which is why you need to replenish your electrolytes. Element is absolutely the best tasting and cleanest option out there, and I drink it daily. So go to sustainabledish.com/LMNT to claim your free gift, and thanks.
I like James Rebanks. Are you familiar with him?
Not really. Mm-mm.
No? James is he's an English farmer, sheep farmer. And his story is sort of, I hate to he would hate that I paraphrase it this way. It's the way I see it. Multi-generational family, sheep farmers, sheep herders, and they were like, "Well, you're too smart to sit on a farm."
I've had that exact same quote said about me by somebody, and I'm not a very smart person, but the bar is in people's minds so low, like that you have to be this yokel sitting on a tractor all day. That And Joel Salatin has a quote about that. He's like, there's 4 mothers sitting around at a soccer game, and they're talking about their kids, and they're like, well, Jimmy wants to be a doctor, well, Stephen wants to be a lawyer, and nobody's ever going to say, well, Thomas wants to be a farmer,
Right. Yeah.
Because it's just this mindset.
I mean, so James went to Oxford. He studied there. He graduated, and then he went back to farming. Right?
Yeah.
And he's very honest about it. It's a tough life. It is. There's a lot of anger and resentment, I think, in some aspect of the competition that kind of happens between these these like groups that then are kind of like outside of society. So there's a lot of infighting within families and any number of different things. It's a really wonderful book, though, because it really, like, we've had like people like Wendell Berry, philosopher, scientist, that have taught me more about the world. Um, you know, that, who are also like dedicated to farming, dedicated to bringing nourishment to the systems that surround them. So I kind of want to like ask, had talk about the inputs to the farm, and like how have you and I don't even know how to necessarily phrase this question, because I think what ends up happening with farmers in general when they're kind of working through that the industrial model is that the key drivers of uh, that sort of play in between inputs in fertilizers, pesticides, any number of different, mortgages on tractors, and any number of different inputs in order to grow this stuff. There seems to be a sort of a sort of play back and forth between these companies to see who can extract as much money from this farmer while he's like working the land. And so the removal of a lot of that stuff can be really scary, can be really, you're kind of removing yourself from an entire system that is set up in a very specific way that allows you to, one, get USDA grants, loans, any number of different things. So you coming on the farm, wanting to not necessarily even have these inputs, but like, or even just slowly weaning off of them as you're kind of moving forward. Can you kind of talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah, well, you just touched on stuff that I could talk about for the next hour and a half. I mean, um, I'm such an
Cool.
idealist, or I've lost some of that idealism, but actually a lot
Mm.
of it. But when I first started farming, I mean, the idealism was extremely high. So I never used any chemical inputs except for some ivermectin to deworm the cattle. But I mean, we never sprayed anything on the farm. And the farm would have benefited quickly from that, but it wouldn't have lasted. And so when we started, I bought a sprayer, and I buy calcium and microbes and molasses and various things to supplement the soil, what the soil is lacking, which our soil was lacking everything when we took a soil
Right.
test in 2014, except for sodium, which was really high. Um, and we have seen enormous improvements by simply giving the soil what it needs, having diverse grasses growing all year, and using grazing animals. I mean, our pH has gone from 5.5 to 6.5. Our organic matter has increased 1%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it allows each acre of
That's good.
land to hold an additional 20,000 gallons of water.
Yeah.
Um, but if you go to Honey Grove, which is my neighboring town, and you go to the Honey Grove grain and peanut, where you can buy seeds and whatnot, every morning there's a circle of farmers, and they're all eating donuts, smoking cigarettes, and drinking coffee, and not one of them wants to be the black sheep. Ian Mitchell Innes once said, "Farmers would rather fail together than succeed alone." And I found that to be very, very true. And that's partially because, they probably did grow up on that farm, and their father grew up on that farm, and they embraced, like everybody else, this chemically dependent mindset, because corporations were promising them, these increased yields and this wealth that would come with it. And the wealth never did come with it. They've been
Mm.
exploited for generations, and they don't want to take the risk of not doing that anymore. So, I mean, it would be really scary for them to do it, not to mention that they have no idea how to do that. They don't know how soil functions. They really are just focused on what's going above the ground, and they have no idea, and they really don't care about what's going on underground. So,
Mm.
um, it's it's a big topic, and the industrial chemical mindset. Their big slogan always is, "Well, we're feeding the world."
Right.
The day that I wrote this op-ed for the Dallas Morning News about the health of soil, their front page article that day was on the drought in Texas,
Mm.
and they interviewed farmers across Texas, and the very last line of that article was, "It's okay, we're feeding the world." And the truth is that they're not feeding the world. I mean, we are feeding more people than we have, but there are still plenty of people that are starving, and 30% of the people in my neighboring town of Honey Grove use the food bank, even though the town is literally surrounded by farms. It's not the goal of industrial agriculture to feed the world. It's the goal of industrial agriculture to make money. And they're very, very good at that. And farmers have been exploited for generations in order for other people to make money. And there's a lot of fear from farmers about that.
Yeah, I mean, even just right to repair. I don't know if you followed any of that stuff. John Deere's tractors.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, absolutely insane. Can you
yeah.
talk about that to the audience a little bit?
Yeah, so I have a John Deere tractor, but it's not a $200,000 tractor that has that. Actually, I'm not sure if I have the right to repair it or not, but they can turn off your tractor, I mean, if they want. So if you like, they can remote turn it off. But there are, yeah, I mean, there are rules that you cannot repair your own tractor. You have to take it to a John Deere facility to do that. And you know, I think almost everybody knows, you know, with GMO seeds, farmers can't save their own seeds, and they're, you know, locked into these horrible contracts. Once they, you know, the genie comes out of the bottle, they can't put it back in. So yeah, I mean, and you know, when I told people I wanted to be a farmer, that I was going to be a farmer, I think that almost everybody thought of the people sitting around in a circle at the Honey Grove Grain and Peanut, and the way that farmers have been exploited for years, and it scared them. Like my father, when I remember I called him and I told him I was going to stop fundraising and leave my career and start being a farmer. And his voice dropped and he said, "So you're going to be a day laborer?" And I was like, "Well, I'm not going to wait, you know, sit in a parking lot and wait for somebody to pick me up and take me to work every day." I mean, and I, you know, explained to him regenerative agriculture, and, you know, his mindset's different now. But yeah, the idea of being a farmer is just scary to people. And it's because, you know, they think of these people that have been exploited for so long, that don't have control over their land, that don't have control over their tractor to fix their own tractor, like you said. And it's a, you know, it's kind of a vulnerable place to be.
Yeah,
For these folks.
before Bayer was before Monsanto was bought out by Bayer, the CEO had given a speech where he said, you know, he said the problem is with the agricultural system is it's not consolidated enough. And so you have like, just so insane to me, but he, you know, we have about 4 companies in the world that do most of the fertilizers, that produce most of the fertilizers. Same thing with pesticide companies. And you know, what I think he was talking about was sort of a subscription model for farmers. This came up yesterday, so it's sort of fresh in my head, but he was saying, like, we want to be able to tell farmers exactly, like, through satellite data and weather data, when to plant, you know, when to harvest, when to apply pesticides, when to apply herbicides. We want to have essentially, like, you bought a subscription to their industrial model, and then you follow every single aspect of that. And so, like, to me, that's one, even if you signed up for that, the second you didn't follow that, you know, you're immediately liable for whatever, right?
Yeah.
But it's a, you know, I think that's the mindset. I think that's what people need to understand about the way that they think about those things. And you know, for Vilsack, who is the
Ag secretary.
Yeah, ag secretary, I listened to him on a podcast, and he was, you know, going forward, he was talking. He said we want the market to develop whatever is supposed to be going forward for our agricultural system. So this market seems to have, you know, sort of a very sapiens-esque, like, you know, idea of the world and objectification of the world. Like, the market will determine what is the best path forward, and I find that enormously dangerous.
Yeah, well, it's not surprising though. I mean,
Right.
it's all about money. We don't grow food in this country to feed people. We grow food in this country for people to make money. And that's the entire mindset. And so it totally makes sense that he would say that. And you know, Nicole Masters in her book For the Love of Soil talks about the unintended consequences of the Green Revolution. That there may have actually been some people that believed in it, that thought that this was actually going to feed the world and change the way that farmers made money and whatnot. But it didn't, and the unintended consequences are that we have, you know, in the Midwest alone, lost something like 580 billion tons of topsoil. We have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico the size of New Jersey because of excess nitrate runoff. That our rural communities are degraded. You know, I could go on, and you already know all of these things, but I was actually thinking a little bit earlier about the book, The Power Broker, which is written by Robert Caro about Robert Moses in New York City, who was the parks director for decades and controlled all of the money from the toll roads that went directly to his coffers. And he believed in the power of roads and highways and the automobile. And so he wanted to transform, and he did transform Manhattan into this, city that had cars in it. He wanted to build 3 bridges across Manhattan, one on the, through the Village, one through Midtown, and then one through the upper East and West Side. And that was stopped. But he was able to build the Bronx Expressway and, several of the bridges across the East River. And anytime there was a lot of congestion, he said, well, we need to build more roads. So they built another bridge, and that just led to more congestion. And the same is true with industrial agriculture. It's, well, we're going to develop these, new technologies to spray on our land so that we can feed more people. And that's going to solve it. But instead, it just creates new problems every single time we do that, because we're just not moving, in harmony with nature. I shouldn't say in harmony with nature. That sounds, cheesy and cliche, but we're trying to strong arm nature. And the more we try to do that, the more problems present themselves.
Yeah, Bill Bryson said this once about the National Forestry Service. He said that they will look at an entire expanse of woods and they'll say, this would look great with a road right through it.
Yeah. Yep. Sounds about right.
Yeah.
The way that I think about it, James, before I forget, is like healthy soil is like a savings account. And, if you have $1 million in a savings account, you're going to be earning more than if you have $1 in a savings account. And rain is kind of like your paycheck, but you don't know when you're ever going to get paid. So you want to have enough money built up in your savings account that you can earn interest, and you don't have to have a paycheck all the time. And then, the industrial chemical mindset is kind of like a payday loan. So if I was to spray a bunch of chemical fertilizer on my land, it would get really green really quickly out here,
right.
or greener than it already is. But the interest on that would be so high that it would be hard to repay that, and then, rebuild that soil functionality after, years of taking out payday loans. And so the goal is to have a lot of money in your investment portfolio or your savings account, not be taking out payday loans all the time. And the other way I think about it is kind of like, post 1940, we began a drug addiction with how we grow food in this country. Yeah. I mean, chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides essentially are like drugs. And I don't think that you have to have taken drugs to understand that, if you do cocaine or start drinking alcohol or whatever, at first it feels great, like you love it, but then you have to take more of it and more of it and more of it to get the same result. And ultimately it comes down to 2 options. You can either quit doing it or you can die. I mean, that's like the ultimate result if you become completely dependent upon those things. And, our industrial model, if we don't start adopting more regenerative soil building practices and we continue just to be completely chemically dependent, these solutions that we created after, World War II are eventually going to play themselves out. And we're just going to be stuck with this desecrated land that can't produce anything.
Yeah, I just picked up a book called The Devil's Element. And it's a writer who was mainly focused on the Great Lakes. He was a really interesting guy. I think the book that he had written prior to this, but it's sort of about the history of phosphorus. It's a really wonderful book. It has that sort of Sapiens-esque quality to it because he's a great storyteller. And he talks a lot about the utilization of phosphorus as a chemical weapon that was like in the bombing of Hamburg is one of the stories that he used. And so you would have this stuff called like elemental phosphorus, and they would drop it from planes. And once it lit up, you couldn't get it out, right? So you could jump into the water if you had it on you. But as soon as you came out of the water and the temperature raised enough, it would just spark up again. Just an absolutely insane story.
Yeah. It reminds me of a family story. I had a cousin, several generations ago that was a crop duster, and he saw that another friend was crop dusting, and he got like some bags that were in the back, or somebody else was flying the plane and he was in the back, and he lit up these fertilizer bags on fire to get the attention of the other plane, and he caught on fire while the plane was flying.
Wow.
And yeah, they were able to land the plane in the field pretty quickly and get the fire out, but
Wow.
not stuff you want to light on fire. Long story short.
Yeah, and that is always that sort of weird paradox, right? Between nitrogen and phosphorus, is that you have these elements that can really bring fertility to the soil. It can bring life to any environment. Well, not necessarily. Too much nitrogen in our forests is actually killing a lot of biodiversity. But yeah, it sort of follows along the same sort of laws. But it's also just an incredible chemical weapon. And we utilize that sort of methodology, I think, in the way that we were thinking about things, right? Because we took that sort of mindset of war with nature. That was the sort of war to end all wars, sort of World War II continuation of one to two. We took that mindset and we applied it to the way that we were going to grow food going forward.
Yeah, which is about 1% of the time. We've been growing food for 10,000 years, and our current chemical industrial mindset has represented about 1% of that time. And so, on a football field, we're on the 1 yard line. And 10,000 years isn't a long amount of time either. Homo sapiens have been around for 300,000 years. And so this is the most frustrating part about the black and white argument on should we be entirely plant-based or completely accept this industrial model of meat production, as if God decided that those were the two things that we could do, and there are no other options for how we grow food in this country and how we feed ourselves. Like the director of Cowspiracy, like he just couldn't quite, or maybe he never tried to understand that it's disingenuous to say that you can either be entirely plant-based or completely support an industrial model of meat production. There are other ways to do it, but we just can't imagine that, almost like, because we're living in this industrial mindset, and so we think, well, that's the only option. But it's not. And we can build new food systems. I mean, think about what we can do, and people say, well, we can't farm differently, we can't produce food differently. That's just disingenuous. I mean, clearly we can. It's just about doing it.
Yeah. The renewables aspect of it as well, the renewables aspect of industrial agriculture, I've been trying to get my mind sort of wrapped around. We take about 40% of the corn that we produce and turn it into biofuels. I mean, it's just such a strange sort of element in our world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we live in a pretty strange world. We don't realize that because it's the water that we swim in. But I mean, just our ascent to the very, very top of the food chain so quickly in an evolutionary sense, and then just our complete world domination and all of the things that we do to make money and support our economy. It's just we live in a bizarro world if you just look at it from 30,000 feet compared to every other living creature on Earth.
Yeah, one of the things, so Sapiens actually talks about this, and I thought it was actually a really interesting aspect. He said that if you would have gone back to, say, even medieval times, when you had a famine, you would lose somewhere around 15 to 20% of the population, say France at the time.
Yeah,
we've gotten that down. When we see a famine, we will lose maybe 1%, and we actually still consider that abhorrent. When we look at that level of progress, it's actually kind of it's an interesting aspect of the way I always try to see it from the perspective of people kind of with that mindset. And it is sort of interesting. I wanted to kind of go into some of the water elements of that. I don't know how much you've been studying that, because I think for me, it's like my enthusiasm for water has gotten it's kind of amazing how much we sort of terraformed certain aspects of even just our waterways. You were talking about the damming up of was a creek kind of coming through your area. We have simultaneously people trying to remove dams in certain parts of the world because we realize the ecological cost of damming water. I just wonder if you kind of want to talk about that a little bit, even just on the farm,
Yeah.
just go a little bit
Well,
deeper.
I'm not. I'm certainly not a scientist. I heard Nicole Nyman talking about water cycling and the importance of healthy soil and grasslands in our ability to cycle water. And clearly, I think most listeners of this podcast and you and I understand the destructive role of industrial agriculture in not just feeding animals in confinement, but also growing soy and corn and other crops and depleting our water resources. The Colorado River, the Ogallala Reservoir is almost gone. I mean, if you fly over the panhandle of Texas, you just see these crop circles that shouldn't be growing there because of Ogallala Reservoir water that they're just pumping out of the ground. And on our farm, I mean, we have several ponds that we've dug that collect rainwater, and that's where our cows drink from. Every summer, I'll irrigate some of our land with those ponds, and then they'll fill back up in the winter. And then that runoff used to go down into Bois Creek that would then flow into the Red River and then ultimately the Gulf of Mexico. And now it's going into Bois Lake, which is owned by the North Texas Municipal Utility District that will ultimately fill up people's swimming pools in Frisco and McKinney, which are north of Dallas. And water their lawns. And of course, also, they'll drink that water. But that water is not being used for any purpose other than just to kind of fuel this urban expansion. And there are three things that we need in this world that we forget about, that we take for granted because they're in such, seeming abundance. That's water, clean air, and food. We also need shelter. And some would argue that we need relationships and et cetera and love. But food, water, and air. And food is so devalued now because there's such an abundance of it. We just don't care about that. But water, is getting to the point where, you'll turn on the national media and you'll see stories on the Colorado River or Lake Mead or, these reservoirs. And, when we start running out of water, the shit's going to hit the fan, and that won't be a good day. For sure.
Yeah. We Judith Schwartz wrote a wonderful book on water. I would recommend anybody read it. One of the things that she said, I think it was Johannesburg and London received the same amount of water per year. Right. Just think about the two is like, very, very different. One, Johannesburg obviously gets huge, downpours of water, where London, if you've ever spent any time there, you're just wet all the time. And it's really about the sort of capacity of that to hold a lot of that water. We have water in our atmosphere, we have fresh water in our atmosphere, and we can pull water from the ground. We can pull deeper and deeper into these aquifers, but we're not recharging them. And recharging them means you have to have cover crops. You have to have green on that land so that the soil can do what it would normally do. Right.
Yeah.
And that's the story. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. But I mean, it's not about the way that we grow food and raise animals in this country, and the industrial model isn't about sustainability. It's about shareholder value and short-term profits. And regenerative cattle ranching and regenerative farming is in large part about building healthy soil so that you can hold water. People think, well, you need to irrigate more or you need to fertilize more, as opposed to you need to increase the organic matter in your soil so that your soil can hold more water so that it can be more resistant to droughts, which is what we're trying to do out here. When it rains, regenerative farmers like to say, when somebody asks how much rain they got, they say all of it, because it soaked into their soil. It didn't run off into another person's soil or into a waterway. But and that takes a long time. You really have to be intentional about building soil, and you have to be patient, which is one of the challenges of regenerative agriculture, is that there are these solutions. I could go into town and buy all of these very quick solutions. but they're not ultimately going to do what I want or achieve what I want to achieve out here, which is, hopefully many years from now when I die, the soil will have an organic matter of 3 or 4%, which is a huge improvement from where it was. And we'll just have a more sustainable farm.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, because and it's not even something that you have talked about a little bit before, but um, uh, the this false dichotomy, this animal versus meat consumption versus plant consumption, this the because that's where for me that's where why I started to get into Sacred Cow and started to produce the film, is because what I saw actually happening was this move in industrial food production to sort of like create this idea of plant-based. Everything is plant-based, you know. Uh,
Yeah, that kind of
industrial ag, like all of that stuff. Yeah.
Well, that goes back to that black and white, this or that solution to problems that people see in agriculture. And really, I think the solution is how. I eat plants and animals. I'm very proud of the fact I'm an omnivore. I have no desire to be plant-based or an entirely carnivore either. But yeah, I mean, we have a garden behind me that is huge, and the quality of the food that comes out of that is phenomenal, and we work hard at it. But it's not an either or, and that's the frustrating part about so many vegan documentaries and people who advocate for plant-based, is that they think that it has to be entirely one way or another. And if you live in a rural community like I do, I mean, I was talking to the woman that delivers my mail yesterday, and we're going to have a couple of vegans over for dinner soon when they come to the farm. And she was like, what you need to do is go to Sam's, and you need to get some barbecue, and you need to get some paper plates, and you just need to put it out for them, And she was like, they don't eat beef. And I said, no, they don't eat any animals, And she was like, okay, well, just make them some spaghetti or something. I was like, well, they're actually vegan, so that the egg and the noodle you can't, And she was like, just blown away by that concept. And that's not to insult her intelligence or anyone else out here, but like, meat is such a fundamental part of so many people's identity that to think that everyone's going to stop eating meat is insane to me. It's just crazy. And there's not one politician in the country. Well, there are a few politicians, but there's not one party that's going to come anywhere close to ever passing public policy that will make it harder for people to eat meat. It's just not going to happen. So to build a more regenerative model and not just say, you have to eat this Impossible Burger or you have to eat this burger from McDonald's, it's going to be a consumer-driven movement. We have to have consumers buy into that, literally and figuratively. People need to spend money buying food from regenerative farms and ranches. And that's going to be the way that it grows, and hopefully solves a lot of our problems. But yeah, to think that, like you said, false dichotomy, to think that I can either go eat, a fast food burger or adopt an entirely vegan lifestyle is just simply not true.
Yeah. I'll tell you a funny story. I was dating a girl who's vegan when I was living in England, and we went to Morocco, and she had somebody write up like a note. It was on a piece of paper in French. I do not eat, the meat of an animal, nor do I eat the dairy of an animal. And I don't eat any eggs or anything like that. And so we went to the street vendor, and he had this stew that he was making. And she showed it to him, and it was a beautiful stew, tons of vegetables, really smelled aromatic. Moroccan food is absolutely delicious. And the guy reads it, and he looks at her, and he reads it, and he's like, not even lamb? Especially not lamb. So
Yeah.
then he's like, okay. And so he takes his hand and he starts pulling out the lamb.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
gives her a bowl of whatever's left over. And she's just like, I mean, we spent 4 days there and she barely ate anything because
Yeah.
like half of the world doesn't understand what even a vegan is. So I
Right.
can definitely relate.
And And James, I don't have any I have no problems with somebody who wants to be a vegan or vegetarian or, just eat Skittles for the rest of their life. That's their choice.
Mm,
But it is frustrating to me for people to say that the solution exists, kind of like a conservative Christian evangelist. Like you have to believe this or you're going to go to hell. The solution exists in only eating plants, even when those plants are grown in monocultures that are completely chemical dependent, that are causing the loss of topsoil, that are contributing to climate change, that are poisoning our water, that's leading to loss of ecological diversity. I mean, there's no ecological diversity on a monoculture soy or cornfield.
yeah,
Uh,
totally.
I mean, they talk about habitat destruction with animals, and that does occur in an industrial system. But there's plenty of habitat destruction going on with the ingredients that people use to, make an Impossible Burger as well.
Sure.
And so it's just it's not really what the food that you're eating that's as important to me. It's how that food is produced. And there are plenty of people that are never going to adopt a plant-based lifestyle anyways. So we have to have a diverse approach to a sustainable food system, to a regenerative food system. And I think that includes eating plants and animals, for a large segment of the population. But if you want to do one or the other, go for it. But I don't think
Yeah.
that the solution exists in just eating plants. It's the how those animals and those crops are grown and produced.
Yeah, it's a shame. Like I'm 49, so uh, like I remember my teenage years. There was one tomato. It was red. Like you
Uh-huh.
had, right? We had three different types of apples, one banana. We so genetically, like through just breeding, have modified most of our world to kind of like, when you were talking about going to 11 Madison Park, like, and trying what everything was plant-based there. It was absolutely delicious. For me, vegetables are absolutely delicious.
Hmm.
Um, like arugula, like certain ones that have these bitter compounds. And like in Italy, they have radicchio festivals where people like just absolutely love the bitter compounds of it, and they feed it to the kids. And um, we should be celebrating all of this diversity more. And again, it comes down to this false dichotomy. We're growing up in these monocultures of both, right? So chickens, one breed, maybe two that we were growing, and then we have all of these sort of heritage breeds. That's the thing that I'm looking for. I'm looking for difference in taste, and I want things to look different. Um, what we were talking yesterday about awe and horror, and I was like, so what do you experience when you walk into a supermarket? And we were laughing about it because it is awe-inspiring, but it's also kind of weirdly horrible, right?
Yeah, and that's the
Yeah.
water that we swim in. That's so normal for people. I mean, when I first started farming, I had processed, these red wattle Gloucester Old Spot heritage pigs, and the pork was
Mm.
red and marbled and beautiful. And my mother, like so many others, in Easter makes a ham, and I had ham, and she just was like, "You don't need to bring one home. I'll just go to HEB, which is a local grocery store in Central Texas, and
Yeah.
buy one." And it really took my family a long time, and friends, and to this day, there's a ton of people that just they don't buy food from local farms. They buy food at the grocery store because that's just where you buy food, right? Uh, and it's just a completely different mindset to say, oh, I can actually go to this farm or go to this farmer's market and buy food from a farmer,
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that, a huge area of growth in the regenerative local food system are the middlemen, the aggregation distribution facilities or the food hubs that work with a collection of local farmers that aggregate that food and then just put it in front of consumers at grocery stores so they don't have to think about it when they're buying ground beef. They just grab it and they buy it.
Right.
Um, And I think that would really encourage a lot more people to transition their land to a regenerative model, especially young people. I mean, a lot of folks, they want to live on a farm, but they don't want to have to go to a farmer's market or multiple farmers market every weekend. They don't want to have to hustle and, work to get people to buy their food and have them complain about the prices. And, we need systems in the middle to be able to make that food more accessible to people and more convenient for people to buy. So that's a huge area of growth, in my opinion.
Yeah. Cool. Is anything else you want to kind of talk about? Like, you want to dive into?
Well, people's identities. What I wrote when I ate at 11 Madison Park last year for my 40th birthday, I sat next to these two women, and I'm a total introvert, so it was not like me to strike up a conversation. But they were about to eat this bread course, and I looked at one of them and I said, "You're going to really enjoy that." And we struck up a conversation, and they said, "Well, what do you do?" Of course. And I said, "Well, actually, I'm a cattle rancher in Texas." And sitting at the 3-star Michelin vegan restaurant in New York City, that their ears really perked up. And the one across the table, who I'm now friends with, her name is Alex Reed. She said, "Well, what do you think about what Bill Gates is doing?" And I said, "Well, I think that he believes in what he's trying to achieve, and that's admirable. But the idea that we're going to stop eating meat in this country is just not realistic." And partially it's not realistic because our identities are so tied up in who we have been and what we eat and what our family system is, that people just aren't willing to question that. But with regards to changing the way we eat from an industrial to a regenerative model, I would just encourage people to simply begin again, as Sam Harris talks about, just to begin again, to challenge your preconceived notions of where you buy your food and how you eat and why you eat, to not just simply try to get that dopamine response from food, but to actually try to support your local economy and have a healthy lifestyle and enjoy cooking and, find some spirituality in the food that you eat. Because again, as Sam Harris says, your only opportunity to engage with your life is in the present moment. But we are so tied to the idea of who we were, being who we are, and that we can't change that. And so, in all facets of life and aspects of life, I would encourage people just to, embrace the present and challenge preconceived notions and begin again.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool.
So that's my sermon.
So it was great. So how do people find you if they're reaching out? Can you, we'll put in the show notes your farm and any of the social media, but it's always good to say it as well.
Yeah, so it's Bois Meat Company. That's spelled, I had to get really clever with the name of the farm. So instead of Locke Family Farm, we named it Bois Meat Company. And that's BOISD''ARC Meat Company. And the Instagram page is Instagram/Bois Meat Co. And then you can get in touch with me through that source. That's really honestly what I use the most, just because I think pictures are a great way to show folks what we're doing. But we're,
the website's beautiful as well.
We're local. We're intentionally local. We don't ship food anywhere. And so if you live in the North Texas area, we'll be happy to sell you really delicious regenerative source of beef and chicken and turkey at Thanksgiving.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Thomas. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, James. This was fun. And we'll be in touch.
Hold on one second.
Thanks so much for listening today and for following my work. If you believe in making sure people all over the world should have access to nutritious food, please join my mission through my nonprofit, the Global Food Justice Alliance. Visit sustainabledish.com/join and become a sustaining member today. All sustaining members get early access to ad-free podcasts plus free downloads, and you'll be helping get healthy protein like meat, fish, and eggs to food insecure kids. That's sustainabledish.com/join. And thank you.